Dynamic offensive wingers don't come around a lot, but when they do, they're always really fun. The prospect spotlight is on Berkly Catton for today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hattie Kalikesh, joined by Sebastian High, and on today's show, we'll be continuing our Prospect Spotlight segments. We'll be discussing Berkly Catton's game in detail today, giving you a scouting report on our assessment of the player. We'll start off with his tools, so the puck skills mainly, the stick handling, shooting, and passing. Then in our second segment, we'll look at the toolkit a bit more in detail and also the habits in Berkly Catton's game that make his game tick. And then in our final segment, we'll talk about the NHL projection for Berkly Catton and the best fit for him in the NHL. Before we get into any of that, though, today's episode is brought to you by Sleeper. Download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. If you're watching on YouTube, remember to like and subscribe. We're so close to 1,000. Help us get there. Make sure that you leave us a comment as well, letting us know what you think about the episode. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rate and review, and make sure to make us your first listen of the day. So I think we can get started with Berkly Catton's overall profile as a player. Talk me through the team he's playing on this year, size, strength, handedness, all that good stuff.
For sure. So Berkly Catton is a 5'11", 163-pound left shot winger who's playing with the Spokane Chiefs in the WHL, which is not the strongest team in the league, and he is very much carrying them statistically. In terms of production, he leads the team in points by about 7 or 8, but it's just him and Connor Roulette, and then very little other production beyond those two players. And he has 43 goals and 51 assists for 94 points through 58 games this season, which is pretty good. That's good production. And what makes Catton so special is his level of dynamism. He's a really high-end handler and passer and playmaker, and thinks the game at a very high pace and is constantly moving, constantly trying to create, and it makes him one of the more dynamic players in this draft class. He's a January 14th birthday, so pretty average age for this draft class. And he's a ton of fun. And there's been quite a bit of debate between him and Caden Lindstrom, for instance, of at least internally for us at Dobber Prospects, we've had many debates along those lines. And while Caden Lindstrom's a popular choice, and I think both of us slightly side with Lindstrom in terms of NHL projection, Berkly Catton's a really special player, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the upside is higher with Catton, but there are some foundations to his to Caden Lindstrom's game that are certainly more interesting, more projectable, and safer for sure. But overall, I think with Catton, what's really interesting is that this is a player who doesn't need to slow down to make plays, and we'll get into that a bit more when we talk about the toolkit. But really, to focus on the puck skills, a lot of it revolves around that. His shot for me is a 7.5. It's a really solid release, and he releases it in motion extremely well. I love his in stride snapshot. It's one of his best tools. And he's able to find those corners really well. And he doesn't need a lot of time time or space really to release that puck. So that's a big kind of asset of his game, in my opinion. It's a factor of his game that he can really build his game around if he needs to, but that's not where his offensive toolkit ends. If you're talking about a dynamic playmaker, Catton fits that bill exactly. I mean, for me, it's him and Celebrity and Demidov are at the top of his class, really, in terms of the ability to create with their speed, and to make plays at that speed and to kind of keep up with the game mentally. So his playmaking as well for me gets a 7.5. It's another really good tool in his arsenal. I like the way he delays passes. I like the way that he can kind of read the situation and figure out what pass is needed for that specific scenario. So you'll often see him kind of hook a pass under a stick. You'll often see him, lift a stick and then pass it under it, that kind of stuff. He's able to hit these really specific, these really small seams with really accurate and hard passes. He's a player who loves to dish the puck and does it really, really well. But when he's given time and space, he can make you pay with a really, really good wrister. On top of that, though, I think the stick handling, I think we both agree, is kind of the standout asset with Berkly Catton, right?
For sure. It's where he's at his most dynamic is when he's handling the puck with speed. And especially like in open ice situations, the way that he's able to solve pretty complex problems with a very little amount of effort, seemingly, with his toolkit is really impressive. He can like pinpoint ways to solve these complex problems, and the way that he's able to leverage his handling makes it almost like weirdly simple for him to execute on them at times, especially against WHL competition. Uh, when he's given even a couple feet of space, he's going to do everything he can with it. And he's able to really push that pace and push defenses back, and is constantly prodding at defensive structures and using his handling to open up lanes to create little gaps to find attacks into the high danger areas and into the low slot. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate with this game is that he's consistently able to leverage his high-end tools to get the puck to the most dangerous places on the ice.
For sure, and for me, that's what separates him from another really dynamic, really skillful raw player in Trevor Conley, for example. Is that Catton's mindset is always, let me fix this problem, let me solve this issue, and kind of get the puck to where I need it. Whereas with Conley, you see a bit more of that. We've talked about it a lot, kind of that pond hockey element, right? I don't see that as much with Berkely Catton, even though he's just as skillful, just as dynamic, just as capable in transition and willing to take players on. He doesn't take them on just to take them on. He takes them on when it's the necessary thing to do, and when he feels like the right thing to do is to hold on to the puck, kind of slow down at the offensive blue line and draw a defenseman to him before kind of opening up a passing lane. He does exactly that. So I think that's a great element of his game and a big part of his puck skills. But where would you rate his stick handling on a rating scale?
Maybe an 8.5. Like, it's a really strong tool. Like, we're not going to give out 8s and 8.5s all that consistently in our evaluations here. Like, those are reserved for like the high end players in each draft class. And while like Ivan Demidov's handling, for instance, slog a 10 on our scale, and Catton doesn't quite get to that level, I think you could even make the argument as high as a 9.0. Like, the
Yeah.
handling is superb with Catton.
Absolutely. I think that's really the standout tool of his game, and I think that's really what's going to shape his game at the next level. You see a lot of players build their game around their shot, build their game around their playmaking ability. But you look at a player like, I don't know, Johnny Gaudreau, Patrick Kane, like those types of players have built their game around their ability to stick handle in a phone booth. So I think that I could see Catton kind of develop similarly, where he has the surrounding, passing and shooting ability in order to kind of uplift that stick handling game and give it some purpose. But the game that he plays still revolves around that stick handling ability, and we'll get into the toolkit and how that kind of interacts with the rest of his skill set, and kind of break down why that's a decent path for him. But overall, I think that it'd be a good idea to develop Early Cannon into a true play creator, a stick handling winger, a player who can drive the wing, then kind of break your ankles, cut inside, draw player in, that kind of stuff. I think that could really be where I could see Berkey Catton kind of build a comfort around this game that really becomes interesting. But that's it for our first segment. We'll get into our second, where we discuss the toolkit and the habits with Berkely Catton and how that reflects itself in this game. We'll get into that right after these messages from our sponsors over at Sleeper.
It's past the halfway point of the NHL season, but there's still time for you to get in on the action with Sleeper. Sleeper is our number one choice here at the Locked On NHL Podcast Network for all of your daily fantasy hockey needs. That's because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. And all you need to do to win 100 times your cash is to correctly predict the outcome of 8 specific player stats. And you can play it safe and go with the stars of the league, like the Nikita Kucherovs, the Leon Draisaitl's, the Connor McDavids, to put up a couple points in the next game. Or you can add a little bit of spice to the equation and go for the young guns, whether it's Connor Bedard, who's now back from injury, Or I don't know who else is really good. Brock Faber is massive in the Calder race, and the production's been skyrocketing with him. That's also an option. So use promo code Locked On NHL, and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code Locked On NHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability.
Alrighty, so moving on to our second segment, we'll be talking about Berkly Catton's overall toolkit and the habits in his game and how they reflect themselves in his game. So I want to start off by talking about the toolkit overall because I think that's a decent element of his game. He's a player that thinks a game at a really high level, and combine that with his ability and also his willingness to take players on, to draw the play to him, to kind of be the dictator of the pace of play on the ice. I think that's a really good combination that works really well with the way that he approaches a game. But yeah, his IQ is one thing that really stands out to me. But where would you rank it overall, especially in terms of offensive hockey IQ?
Yeah, like I think certainly a strength. Like I'd probably rank it at least at a 6.5 grade on our scale, which is a significantly above average rating, maybe even a 7. There's some inconsistency game to game. He's not like there are certain games where I could rank that as high as like a 7.5 or an 8, where he's just doing everything. He's reading every single play and not missing a single beat. And then there are other games where when he's making a couple mistakes early on, they tend to snowball a little bit as the game goes on, and then that rating's a little bit lower then. But what is so exciting with Catton is that he is such a quick processor of play, and he's constantly scanning the ice and looking for options and strikes very aggressively when he sees them open to him. And I think that's a very projectable element that allows him to really wring as much as he can out of his toolkit and out of his strengths, which I've seen a lot of this season.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. I think this is a player who, you know, even though it's not necessarily polished right now, I think that his reading of the game when he's on is among the best in this class. Like, there are games where he just completely controls everything that goes on. Everything flows through him. You watch him on the power play, and that's the most obvious element. Like he
Yeah.
is the player who's making the whole power play tick. And there's a reason why he's leading his team in points right now. And that's not something you always see for a draft eligible. Especially not, the amount of points that he's scoring right now. Like, it's one thing to lead your team in points when everyone's at around a point per game, but he's got 94 points in 50 games. Like, so it's just it's absurd what he's able to do right now. It's a great part of his toolkit, and I think the intelligence really kind of limits itself to the offensive game, though, right? I don't really see Berkely County get involved defensively all that much. There's a lack of motor for sure, but there's also a lack of understanding of offensive cycles on the defensive side of the game, right?
For sure. Like that is one of the key drawbacks in his game, and one of the reasons that he's a bit more risky compared to a player like Caden Lindstrom, who is just already quite refined in all three zones with a ton of room to grow. With
Yeah.
Catton, there's a ton of more room to grow in transition and in the offensive zone, certainly, and it's what he's already great at. But the defensive game, I think it would top out as maybe NHL average. I don't see too much growing room beyond that stage. That said, he is really intelligent. I think once he starts to really integrate his scanning habits and gets a better understanding of how to create small little advantages in his own way as a winger in the defensive zone, I think he might be able to get to that point where he's no longer a liability in his own zone, which at the moment he is at times in WHL.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case in the NHL if he's developed well. But it's never going to be a particular strength. That said, he gets involved defensively in some other ways. Like I like his play on the forecheck. He shows a way better motor on the forecheck than he does on the back check, for instance. And he's able to
Yeah.
really get underneath opponents and out leverage them at times. And while he's not the biggest player in the world, he has a good like low center of gravity, and he's a really strong skater, and he's able to kind of pickpocket them and get underneath them and try to regain possession in that way. But there's definitely still a need to apply some of those habits to the defensive zone.
For sure. Yeah, I think the thing with Catton is I think it really revolves around his strong base. So, like, he's a player who you can't really push him off of his stance really well.
Yeah.
Once you get in a situation where it's muscle against muscle, like he's screwed. Like, he's not necessarily the biggest or strongest player, but if he's got if he's got his feet set and anchored, he's really hard to push off. So that makes him really useful on the forecheck, but also in puck protection scenarios along the boards, that kind of thing. Again, he's not the biggest, but I think the mechanics of his skating really work in his favor when it comes specifically to protecting pucks, to forechecking. However, the skating itself, I think, is a part of his game that slightly sets him back in terms of his overall toolkit. Because this is a player with amazing hands, with a great ability to make plays, to play give and go. He understands the game at an advanced level, but sometimes his feet just aren't quick enough for the rest of his game. Um, he is really capable when he's got that head of speed, but in terms of accelerating in short ice, in terms of cutting corners really abruptly and kind of evading players in these small ice scenarios, I think that kind of sets him back. What do you think, though?
Yeah, I mean, I've liked the skating. It's certainly the weakest of his tools if you add in the trifecta that we talked about in the first segment. But
Yeah,
I'd still rank it above average, like maybe a 5.5 or a 6 grade, but it does lag
yeah,
a bit behind the others. I think that the lack of acceleration is certainly something I've also noticed, but I'm personally hopeful that once he's able to really add some more muscle to his lower body, that will be less of an issue and that he's able to get a lot more power out of his first 2 or 3 strides to really gain that speed. But when he
yeah.
is playing with momentum, and he's quite good at retaining momentum through turns and through shifts, when he's playing with that speed, he really does have a head of steam going with him, and he's really quite adaptable. And I like the agility in speed to be able to like switch lanes, and he's constantly trying to shift directions, and he's certainly not linear as a skater. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's decent, but it's not. It doesn't quite match like that top 5 caliber tool that the others are.
Yeah, for sure. Regarding the skating, I'd probably give it a 5.5, maybe even a kind of high five. This is a type of tool that I feel like you can definitely add to. And as a player who's 5'11" and 163, he's definitely got room
Yeah,
to grow into that frame, add some weight. Um, but it's more than just hitting the gym and hitting your PRs on deadlifts. It's really specific, intricate work in terms of where you're adding muscle, and what kind
for
of drills
sure.
you're doing. But I think that he can get there. It's just as he stands right now, I don't necessarily see the skating as a bona fide plus tool, at least not at the level that gives you so much promise when you look at his puck skills. Like that's there's a gap there for sure. But I think it can close that gap over time, and with really good work, with a scouting team, with a development team that knows what it's doing, you can turn Berkly Catton into a really good skater on top of having the puck skills that he does, and that combination is why I have him in my top five, and so do you. So, you know, he's a very interesting prospect in terms of the toolkit, in terms of how his tools interact. There's some good, there's some bad there, but overall, I think there's a lot of gaps that can be closed with decent development. But that wraps things up for our second segment. We'll talk about Berkly Catton's NHL projection and which team would be the best fit for Berkly Catton after these messages from our sponsors at eBay Motors.
Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and far more. Whether into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what it is that you are looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, which is available to US customers only, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply.
Alrighty, so moving on to our final segment, we'll be closing things off with the NHL projection with Berkly Catton and the best team fit for him. Let's start with the projection here. For me, Berkly Catton has some of the highest offensive upside in this class. He's got the skills in order to kind of make it work. He's constantly driving the middle. He's constantly looking for that space in pockets in the offensive zone. So there's a projectability to his offensive game that pairs really well with the high end skill. So for me, I don't really know what the floor is. I would say there's still a chance that Canton doesn't make the NHL, but it's a really slim one. Um, I could see him at worst being kind of your third line, kind of skill driver, kind of like a Jack Roslovic or a Mason Appleton, kind of that kind of range of player at his worst. But the higher end of his upside is really alluring. We're talking about a player who I think could score 90 points at his best in the NHL. Like this is a player who has the toolkit in order to make it work offensively. But this is a player you're going to have to surround with some good defensive players. If he ends up on a line with a really good defensive center, let's say in Minnesota with Joel Eriksson Ek, that kind of vibe in terms of center for him, I think that could work really well. And although Catton has played some games at center, I see him project a lot more as a winger. Do you agree?
I fully agree. I think that like the off puck support habits down the middle when he is playing at center are quite raw. Still, obviously, the defensive support, as we mentioned, is also a weakness at this stage in his career.
Yeah.
And on the wing, when he's on the wing, I really love how he's able to use his pace to its maximum. When he's playing down the middle, he's really trying to slow the game down. But I like Catton the most when he's trying to really play at his higher speeds because all of his tools work so well at his top speeds. And when he's playing at center, he really does dial that pace down a little bit. And I think that he's a bit less effective in that role, on top of having
Yeah.
responsibilities that I don't think are making him like a better player necessarily to have as a burden. Because as you mentioned, if you play him in a situation where he has a defensive center to play with, and we'll get into like potential NHL teams later, but like a Nick Suzuki would be a really good stylistic fit, for instance, for Berkly Catton, being
Yeah.
able to just rely on a consistent, highly intelligent, defensively capable center would really open up Berkly Catton to get the maximum out of his high end skill and all of his upside. And I think that if a team tries to develop him as like a two-way center or something along those lines, they're going to be a little bit disappointed by the end product, because that's not really how you maximize Berkly Catton's value.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. I mean, you have to play to his strengths when you're developing him, and you need to take that high octane offensive game, that ability to consistently make plays at high speeds and turn it into something interesting. And if you put Catton at center, you're hindering that by making him kind of the player who needs to slow down the pace of play, who needs to cut who needs to man the middle, stop up at the offensive blue line and kind of make a play from there. You're putting him in an F3 position, which isn't necessarily where he kind of thrives and excels, right? Whereas if you put him on the wing next to a defensive center, next to a power forward, for example, I think that's exactly where Catton would be comfortable. And overall, I think that when I mentioned the 90-point upside, I also include the 40 goal upside in there because I think he's got the toolkit in order to make that work. For me, the shot goes so underrated with Berkely Catton. I think that that's an element of his game that doesn't get appreciated enough. And for me, it's really just the fact that he's both able to make plays at high speeds and he's able to shoot in motion. That combination is deadly. Like that works in the NHL. And I think that's going to be his bread and butter is, you know, coming off taking a pass from a center, using crossovers to kind of gain the dots and then kind of rifling within those crossovers into the top corner. That's mainly what you're going to be seeing out of Berkely Catton in the NHL. I think that's going to be really a part of his game that thrives. But I think a lot relies on his ability to improve his cycle game because his cycle game is fairly linear. It's really hard for Catton to create in the offensive zone through cycles because he's a player that works so well at high speeds, and you need to slow down when you're on the cycle. You can't just be cycling at high speeds. It doesn't work that well. Um, so that's a part of his game I really want to see improve overall. But yeah, I think he can get there. There's a lot of room to improve in his game. There's room to add weight. There's room to grow in terms of his habits, his tools, and the way he supports play in the offensive zone on the cycle. All that can come together fairly well, but a lot relies on his ability to add maybe 20, 30 pounds of weight. I think that's going to be the main factor that changes things in this game. But in terms of NHL team fits, you mentioned Nick Suzuki as a great stylistic fit. I think the Montreal Canadiens could use a player like him, and the
Hugely.
Habs don't really have a yeah. I mean, they don't really have a player that has that above a point per game upside right now in their team, right? Like this is the type of player like they need a player who can write or who can rack up points, who can be the offensive center of his line without playing at center, if that makes sense, right?
For sure. Like the Habs need more offensive fulcrums. Like at the moment, like Nick Suzuki is playing that role quite well this season on top of putting up some really solid defensive results, but it's been a pain at times with the lack of offensive support beyond that top line with Suzuki, Caulfield, and Slavkovsky in recent months. That said, I think there are a couple other teams as well that would be excellent fits. Like, of course, Montreal needs scoring. Like, we've been saying this for the last, like, what, 30 years? This is not a shock. But beyond that, some other teams that are drafting in that range, I think, would be pretty nasty fits as well. Like, you mentioned Minnesota, which I think is an interesting one. But beyond that, the Buffalo Sabres would be hilarious to me because they're just hoarding
Oh
talent. And this would be another example
my
of that. Like having Zach Benson center a line with Berkly Catton would just be pretty funny in terms of like
yeah, and just throw
meshing. Yeah, like
yeah, you just throw Tage Thompson next to them, right? Just for
why
fun, just to
not?
have a big guy in there,
Just
right? Like it's
just
just yeah,
have some fun with it. Totally.
yeah.
I think that would be a really fun fit. And the other one I'll say would be maybe the San Jose Sharks with that Pittsburgh Penguins draft pick. If the Pens end up missing the playoffs, and Berkely Catton could fall as far as what, like 13, 14, reasonably speaking. If the San Jose Sharks end up drafting a defenseman with their personal pick and they don't land Macklin Celebrini, if they go for a player like Artem Loshunov, for instance, or Anton Salayev, adding Berkely Catton with that Pittsburgh draft pick would certainly upgrade their draft class.
Yeah, that'd be absurd. I'd just be absolutely shocked if Cannon leaves the top 10. Like teams have to be able to see the skill level there. He's extremely, extremely skilled. I think that even though teams are a bit more hesitant when it comes to undersized, skilled players, I think they're going to be able to see with Cannon that there's enough there to make him a really, really solid NHLer. It's not like it's not like the situation last year with Andrew Crystal. Like Crystal had some significant setbacks to his game.
Oh yeah.
Even though I don't necessarily like Catton's defensive game, or I think his skating could need some work and he needs to add some weight. None of these areas are bona fide weaknesses or like abysmal elements of his game. Whereas with Crystal, it was just so clear how inconsistent he was offensively. Like he would disappear from games at times, and but when he was on, he was the best player in the draft along, with those top end players. But then on the flip side, his defensive game was near non-existent. I don't think this is the same situation with Ken. So I'd be extremely, extremely surprised if he leaves the top 10. But if he does, whoever is there needs to run to the stage and pick him. Like for me, there's a significant gap between Canton and whoever's at 11th overall. Like there's a decent gap there. Um,
Zane Parekh?
Other than that, I mean, in terms of NHL fits, yeah, yeah, no, definitely. I think teams are coming around on Zane Parekh. If Grant McCagg's come around on Zane Parekh, I think NHL teams have come around on Zane Parekh. But we'll see how
Awesome.
that goes down. That'll be really interesting. But in terms of other teams, I mean, I'm looking at the Chicago Blackhawks right now. If they don't pick it first, I think that it's too early for Canton at second, third, fourth, like that kind of range. But there's a lot of options there, and the thing with this draft that's so interesting is that from 2 to 9 to 10, like it's a really like it's a tight gap in that range, right?
It is wide open, and I would not be shocked if Berkely Catton got picked fourth overall, and I would not be shocked if they got picked like 15th overall. Like he is an undersized winger, and those players typically fall. And he is super like he's a bit boomer bust, right? Like there's a super high upside, but the floor is significantly lower than a lot of the other players that will be available in that range. And I'm sure NHL teams will have a level of skepticism
Yeah,
around that, but the skill is just too overwhelming for him to fall past a certain point.
for sure. There are updates up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. Again, we're so close to 1,000 subscribers. It would help a lot if you hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, though, make sure to make us your first listen of the day and leave us a rate and review. That also helps the channel out. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your news and updates about what's going on around sports. And make sure to tune in for our next show as we continue our prospect spotlights for the month of March. This has been Hattie Kalikesh with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.